Hi, my name is Ashraf Ram, and today I am joined by Abdullah Koker, and we are the co-hosts of the podcast The Second Curve. And essentially, this podcast focuses on the second curve of learning that people often go through in their career, along with stories and experiences that shaped who they are today. And our goal is to take these stories and share them, along with uncovering what the next big thing will be in their industry. Hi, Chris. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right.
Yeah, so
So,
if you want to give a quick rundown before we get started, the first question we're going to ask is how you got started in procurement. But for anybody who's maybe not in the loop, if you could explain what procurement is, what kind of industry it is, and again, getting on how you got started into it.
How I got started in procurement, when I left school and before I went to university, I had a year where I worked in a company in the UK called Roundtree Macintosh, which that company name may not be well known to all your listeners, but it was a huge confectionery company that eventually got bought by Nestle, so it doesn't exist anymore. But they're best known for Kit Kat, which is probably one of the biggest selling products in the world from a confectionery perspective. And it was supposed to be 2 6-month placements essentially, and the first one was in purchasing as it was in those days. And then as it turned out, I ended up spending the whole year in that function. Somebody went on maternity leave, and so I sort of stayed on for the full year. And that was my first introduction to it. And essentially what we were doing was the group that I was part of was basically buying parts for the factory, essentially. So, replacement parts for machinery, for running the whole plant itself, etc. And it was, in those days, it definitely was purchasing. It was just a case of somebody would come and say, I want to buy this. We would go and find somewhere to buy it from in that sense. And it was pretty transactional in that regard. But I really enjoyed it, and that was my first step in procurement. When I then left university, I had a few paths or options to take. And as it happened, the procurement one was the one that I took, and kind of then spent most of my career in procurement, but we'll come on to that later.
yeah, interesting. And so now, do you want to talk about like what companies you worked in, and like how you changed in your career within procurement? You want to talk about before we go into like lessons and also how procurement, the industry will be changed. You want to talk about what in companies you were in?
Yeah. So when I left uni, I joined a company called Delaney, which was an automotive supplier. So basically, they were making heating and air conditioning units for cars and actually for big lorries, wagons as well from that point of view. So that was my first experience getting into kind of direct materials. We were buying components that went into the heaters and air conditioning. And that was sort of, as I say, first job out of uni. I did that for a couple of years. Again, enjoyed it from the kind of procurement point of view. Automotives, is a great industry to learn in early on, because it's pretty high pressure. The customer is always right, which you could say in a lot of industries, but there is no saying no to an automotive customer in that sense. So it was definitely trial by fire, which I really enjoyed, and really great people that I worked with there as well. And then I left there really because my now wife, who I'd met at university, she was finishing at uni, and she worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And in the UK, where we were at the time, that's mostly, or it was mostly, around kind of the home counties, as they're called, around the sort of London area. So I moved from Southwest Wales, which is where I was with the prior company, and moved to Xerox, actually. So again, different industry, great company, obviously, massive name. They were coming off the back of hard times, if you like, in the 70s, when they were sort of decimated by Japanese competition, but they still led in kind of certain areas. And I would say probably still to this day, the best organized company I ever worked for. Really impressive the way that they operated. Very clear and very consistent throughout the company. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't there that long, because I think it was 8 weeks after I joined, they announced they were closing the plant that I was working at. And I could have stayed with them, but it would have meant moving back west again. And I wanted to be where my wife was. So I left them and went to a building products group. So again, different sector, not necessarily by design, but I'm really glad that happened, that I got the chance to work in quite a few different sectors, and some more, as you'll see as we go further on, just because the learnings are different in every one. Every company operates differently, but each sector has got its own unique elements to it. And in the building products side, I was with Caradon, it was the company, the group, for about 9 years. The group grew quite a lot, bought big acquisition of a whole number of other companies that were in the similar space. And that was my first exposure to what's become kind of like a core process for procurement people around the world, really, in many respects, which is category management. And I'd never come across that before, and was lucky to be kind of trained. We had a consulting group that was supporting the company, and had the opportunity to become a category manager and sort of learn all the process and techniques. And it completely changed my view about what procurement was or what it could be. And yeah, really enjoyed that. And that's still, I mean, that would have been in the, let me think, early 90s probably. And, that category management is still found around the world in procurement organizations in various forms. So after Caradon, I went to a packaging group called First Carton. And that was, again, different sector, providing packaging predominantly into confectionery, but also into the drinks industry. So if you think about the complex cartons that you see whiskey bottles in, if you're at an airport duty-free, whiskey bottles are usually in these very highly decorated complex cartons. We made the majority of those, Scottish industry particularly. And the interesting bit about really why I went there, yes, it was packaging, so that was different for me, but it was also that it was a management buy-in. I wasn't part of the buy-in, but basically there were three guys who kind of worked together, came together to buy this group of companies from a much larger group, with the intent of kind of growing through acquisition and spinning it off or selling it eventually. Didn't quite work out that way for them, but it was a really interesting time to be involved. The interesting thing for me in many respects, having come from a corporate environment, was that then, I'd be sitting with a CEO, on a daily basis, essentially, which of course in a large corporate, you don't get the chance to do that. But also that he would talk to me about stuff which in corporate you would never hear, so he'd be talking, well, we're thinking about buying this company, and in a corporate setting, nobody would ever tell you that unless you were in the, the vital few at the center of the company. So that was just really interesting learning, very dynamic, bit kind of sort of chaotic to some degree, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. But then eventually they did sell the company, and so I left at that point. That was kind of the interesting bit, if you like, for me. And I went to a consultancy, and it's actually the consultancy that I mentioned earlier when I was at Caradon that trained us in category management. And I went to work for them for a while and worked with clients in again, different industries, telecoms, also in the building sector as well. And so that was a good time, a lot of learning. Unfortunately, that company kind of imploded. Long story behind that, but it had grown very quickly. And then unfortunately, one of the clients basically let them down, and the company sort of fell apart, unfortunately. But it was probably the largest procurement consultancy in the world by that point, because there weren't many procurement consultancies anyway, but we had offices in US, Australia, France, Germany, UK, and about 200 people, I think, at its height, and all dedicated to procurement. It was, pretty special time to be there, really. And it led to my next opportunity, which was to move to Switzerland to join Novartis. So I wasn't working with Novartis as a client, but Novartis was a client of the consultancy. And the guy who was working with them kind of said, look, they're looking for somebody to introduce, implement, build category management within their organization. Would you be interested? And so I was lucky enough to get that job. And that was, obviously that was a momentous time for us, because we left the UK for the first time. And moved to Switzerland. Other than for the interview we'd never been to before, no experience of it at all. And we had two very young daughters at that point. They were like sort of 3 and 1, which worked in our favor, to be fair, because we kind of said, worst case, we go, we hate it. We could stay for 2-3 years, whatever. At least on the CV, you've got some international experience, and it's all good in that sense. But actually, we stayed and loved it. We went to the US for a while, which I'll come on to, but we came back to Switzerland again, and it's home, as far as we're concerned. We don't plan to go back to the UK, but you can never say never. You know how things go. And I had a long career at Novartis. I was there 18 years, as I mentioned, doing a stint in Boston, in Massachusetts, which was fantastic. A great place to live, great city. Loved all the sport, the music, the opportunity to see a lot of America while we were there, obviously, as well. Can never see all of it in the 3.5 years that we were there, but we did see a lot. But yeah, so I won't go through all the roles at Novartis, but basically worked in the pharma business. I worked in the group organization for the last kind of probably 10 years of my career there. A lot of focus on transformation, a lot of focus on supply collaboration and innovation as well. And then left them in 2020 and went to an organization called Avantor, which is a life science distribution company, also US based, just outside of Philly. But I was working out of Switzerland from home. joined in the middle of COVID, so didn't meet any of my team for kind of 18 months, which was not so easy, or didn't meet them in person at least. But really interesting business. Again, it's life sciences, but it's a different part of the value chain. So that was a great learning as well. Distribution, I'd never worked in before. It's a very different mentality and way of operating than sort of traditional companies, if you like, in that sense. And then, I left Avantor just about a year ago because I kind of took a conscious decision that I wanted to do different things, and I wanted to do things that kind of motivated me and interested me. So I now do a variety of some consulting work, some work with startups and angel investing, and also some voluntary work as well. And we can talk about that a bit more later. But yeah, that's sorry, probably a long answer to your question, but that's the background to my career.
You want to talk about some lessons that you learned from Avantor and Novartis, because I think you've worked there like recently and for like a pretty long time, both of them, or especially Novartis. So you want to go into some lessons that you learned or some takeaways that you got from there?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's interesting. If I think about my time at Novartis in particular and what it meant for procurement as a profession, not just at Novartis, we were going through a time in the world where everything was about kind of globalization through the 90s and into the 2000s. And so a lot of what we were doing was kind of thinking all the time, not everything, but, how can you move things to a global level? How can you get the leverage from moving stuff to a global level, working with bigger suppliers, better coverage, all that kind of stuff? And so I think I came to Novartis with probably a bit of a kind of process mindset to a certain extent. Things should be done in a certain way, but the complexity of that organization, it's 120,000 people, it's in 150 countries in the world, whatever it is, and massive organization. I learned a lot about the pace at which companies work. Pharmaceutical does work at a different pace from automotive. Automotive is moving at a much faster pace than pharmaceutical is, and you have to learn to adapt to that. So I think I became much more, I hope anyway, I became much more pragmatic over time in terms of thinking about, there isn't one way of doing something, that's for sure. And you've got to think about, well, how do you work around challenges, whether it's people, process, technology, whatever. How do you kind of figure your way out so that you can get stuff done rather than trying to chase perfection a lot of the time, and it has to be done this way. So I think that was one. I think certainly as well throughout my career, to be honest, but you sometimes don't realize these things till later on. A big part is getting under the skin of the business and really understanding the people, the different functions you're working with, what's driving them. How do we, as a company, make stuff, whether it's goods or services? How is it we actually do that? And how do we actually make money? What is it that actually makes money for the company? And I think probably a common theme, and we'll again touch on later, it's very easy to get siloed, particularly in a really big corporation. Procurement in Novartis, we were something like 1,500 people. There's certainly procurement organizations that are a lot bigger than that, but there are also many that are clearly much smaller than that. And so it's very easy to get sort of very inward looking about your own issues, your own problems, the things that we're trying to fix, and kind of forget a bit about, well, what's the business going through? What's happening to our partner functions? What challenges are they facing? And frankly, what are we doing to help them? And are we helping them, or are we just getting in the way? So there's that part of really understanding the business. And that leads certainly into that notion of trying to see things from other people's perspectives. Again, it's easy to kind of think of it as, well, this is the procurement issue, so we've got to fix that. It's like, yeah, but again, the rest of the business is not looking at it that way. They're looking at it from marketing or finance or R&D or whatever it is. So really trying to understand what matters to them and why, excuse me, is really important. And I think if you've seen, there's an Apple TV series called Silo, which is actually in its third series right now, which has some sort of parallels to business life in some respects. You've got this silo of people who all think they're the only people in the world, and then it turns out that spoiler alert, there's lots of other silos all around them that they're not connected to. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, we can all end up in that kind of mindset if we're not careful. Been enjoying watching that. And then I think the last thing I would talk about is probably just that notion of, be inquisitive, question things more and more. Don't just accept stuff at face value, but also listen even more. I think, that it's one of those things where, again, so often in business, you're trying to get your point across and trying to get your argument across why we should do something this way. And it's like, yeah, you know what? take a moment to listen and understand what the supplier or what your internal customer or whatever it is, what is it they're saying and what is it they're dealing with. So those are all things that I think have really stuck with me, and that they are, frankly, mostly people-related things in many respects, because ultimately that's what business is, it's people. So those are probably the major ones, I would say.
Yeah, and do you think like a lot of these lessons have now played into your kind of shift in this last year, going towards what you want to do? Are these things that, these are a lot of interpersonal relationship lessons, and do you think that you really like will go forward with these in your new endeavors? And is there anything that you've learned with this new change of pursuing a lot of angel investing, or even having your own advisory business? I'm just curious if there's anything new.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, I'll pick up on some of the different parts as you mentioned. So if I think about the advisory part, I'm sort of on the other side of the table in a way now, in some respects. You're talking to either ex-colleagues or to, businesses that you might be aware of, but not necessarily worked with. And yeah, obviously I've been on the other side of the table listening to people trying to sell me stuff in the past. And, I'm very conscious of that piece of kind of, well, okay, what was the stuff that resonated with me when I had somebody come and approach me, versus just kind of like, yeah, this is one of 10 conversations I'm having today that are the same, or similar. So there's definitely a part there which I think it's helpful to have been on the other side of the table, and not, for instance, just in inverted commas, if I just had a sales career, then I'd be coming at it from a different angle. And now, a salesperson could obviously say the same thing in reverse. But so it's definitely, that's definitely useful for me, I find, from that perspective, in terms of, again, trying to get in the space of the other person, understand what it is that they're thinking about. I think the angel investing part feeds a few things for me. One is it feeds partly just the curiosity and the innovation. I've spent quite a bit of time working in innovation, and particularly in Novartis. And, I'm always inspired when I'm listening to startups do a pitch, and you kind of like, so often I just find myself thinking, how did you have that idea? That is such a good idea. Where on earth did you come with that from? I'm just partly envious, I think, as much as anything else, because that's not necessarily my skill set. But I think the other thing with angel investing is it just exposes me to something where I'm learning all the time there. I'm by no means an expert in that space. Just getting to learn all the aspects of how does the kind of fundraising cycle work for them in that sense, and the various series rounds that the companies go through, but also how professional investors look at these companies and judge them, because again, I've sat in plenty of calls where I've kind of thought, brilliant, fantastic idea. And then you have the wash-up meeting afterwards, and the kind of deal leaders are going, yeah, that's not going to work, So, and it's like, oh, right, okay, damn it, I thought that was good. But yeah, then you have to understand why, what is it that's driving them to think that? So I love that part of it, just because it's something new, and it's an exposure that I'd had a little bit of, but not a lot from that point of view. So yeah, those have been kind of big carryovers, if you like, from what I do from a work.
But you also said that, volunteer work is a huge part of what you do. So it's played a huge role in, your career in life. And how do you think that has an impact on, like, maybe your job, or like, you want to explain some of that to us, and then maybe like how your takeaways connect to that as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think the interesting thing with Avantor, it was a company I knew because it was a supplier to Novartis, and I'd worked with them when I was in Boston. I was heading up procurement for the research division of Novartis. So naturally, a life sciences distribution company was one that we knew quite well, and that they're a global player. As I mentioned, it was distribution, so very different type of organizational way of working from what I was used to. And it was also a much smaller company. It was probably, it was about 13,000 people, roughly speaking, at that time, maybe a little bit less even. So, a tenth of the size from a numbers of people point of view. And, there's pros and cons to that, obviously. But one of the things is it was far less complicated. It had its share of complication, for sure. It had its share of kind of silo mentality, as many companies do. But it was relatively easier to get to the person you needed to get to. It wasn't sort of as difficult to figure out, who is it that I actually need to go and get approval for XYZ, or that I need to go and ask for their help for something, or, whatever it was. So that was really interesting. I think a couple of other things that were really sort of important to me there. I think one is the nature of distribution in that space, at least, means that some of our biggest suppliers were also customers and also competitors. So we had some really interesting and complex relationships, and it's quite hard getting your hands around all of that. And sometimes for good reason, because you have to keep some legal separation between certain parts of the organization. But that was a really interesting learning there about how do you work in that environment. It's not a traditional buyer-supplier relationship in that sense. And also because you're distributing products, it's not the same as self-manufacturing. And so you're not as in control. We didn't own the product design. That was obviously owned by our suppliers. They have a big say in the pricing of the product, obviously, because it's their product and they want to have that in the market and they want it priced correctly in the market. And our job as a distributor is to obviously do that and drive growth for them and for us. So that was very different from anything I'd done before. And even if you think about the point when I joined, when we were during COVID, prices was the least important thing in some ways at that point in time. It was still important, but the reality was every pharma company in the world wanted preferential treatment and wanted their product first and wanted to be assured that they were going to get, particularly PPE. Obviously, that was a massive issue around the world, but not just that. And there were many challenges around supply. And ultimately, price was not the prime discussion at that point. So it was really around how do we make sure that our customers are getting what they need and ultimately that their end customers, whether it's patients or hospitals or whatever, are getting what they need. So very, very different. And it's one of the things I actually liked a lot versus Novartis is that when you work in big pharma, the reality is that the concept of what is a customer is a bit vague, frankly, because ultimately, who is it? Is it a patient of a drug? Yeah, for sure it is. Is it a governmental organization that like the FDA in the US as an example? Is it the key opinion leaders? Is it the groups that are organized around certain diseases that provide support? Is it the insurance companies? So as a procurement person in Novartis, you are never talking to a customer. And not least actual patient customers, that there's very strict rules around, obviously who can talk to them. So customer was always a bit far off for us, if you like. At Avantor, because we were a step sort of earlier in the value chain, our end customers were big pharma, or it was university hospitals or university research institutions, etc. So we could talk to them. And as the kind of de facto CPO, I did get the chance to talk to CPOs in our customers. So that was really meaningful because, again, you can connect with them. We talk the same language, if you like. We could sort of work together. I really enjoyed that part of Avantor as well from that perspective. It was a really interesting organization, and learned a lot from it.
And I think that there's a lot to be learned from your quite expansive career. You've worked, globally. And this is a question we ask everybody who comes on here is if you were graduating from university tomorrow, right? You're around 2022. What would you do right now? Like, would you do your career differently? Like, if you were, like, two things, if you were to be able to go back in time, would you change anything? And if you were starting today, what would you be looking at? You're on the forefront of a lot of things regarding procurement and consultancy, and you're being able to see so many startups as an investor. So I'd love to hear your perspective on if you were, a young, ambitious kid, what direction would you go?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't regret at all anything that I've done, partly just I'm not one of those people that you can't change the past, so what's done is done. But I think the time we're living in now is clearly very different from when I graduated as a for instance. So, and that time of spending your whole career in one function is not so much the way that people think now, and rightly so in my opinion. So fairly early in my time in Novartis, we were looking at, when we were thinking about talent development within the company, we were kind of saying, look, we want procurement to be a step that people take as part of their journey through Novartis, but it should be an essential step because you need to understand how to work with external partners. And so it was very much of, we want to feed the organization with great talent as they flow through procurement and into, other parts of the business. And I think in many ways that still sort of grounds my thinking in terms of, if I was starting today, I would definitely look to get as many different experiences as I could. Now, I've had a lot of different experiences through sector, but not through function. And I would definitely do both, frankly, if I had the opportunity now. There's nothing wrong with staying in a single function or even staying in not many people stay in a single company their whole career these days, but it still happens, depending on what you want, obviously, from your career. But I think ultimately, if I was starting today, I would definitely be looking at kind of going, okay, I want to do a stint in finance, in marketing, in R&D, whatever it is, to really learn the business. And back to the point I made earlier about need to understand how the company makes whatever it makes, whether it's a service or a good, and you need to understand how it makes money. And then I think if you've worked in all those different functions, you get such a better view of the company and how it operates. So I would definitely take more of that path. And I would mix different sectors as well, because I think that's been fascinating, and it's been helpful in consulting as well. Because of course, if you come in and say, "Well, I've spent my whole career in one sector," and then you're trying to consult with somebody in a different sector, then they tend to be a bit kind of like, "Well, you don't know us. We're different. Everybody's different and special." So, which understand. So I think definitely from that perspective, I would take a more varied approach. And I've had a few kind of sliding doors moments in my career. I mean, when I think of that time I mentioned at the beginning at Roundtree's, where I had potentially 2 6-month placements in different functions, but I ended up spending 12 months in one function. Now, if I'd gone into another function for the second 6 months, who knows what I would have done after university. And actually, when I left university, I had the job offer to go into the automotive business, which is the one that I ultimately took, which was purchasing and procurement. But the other role that I was looking at was actually marketing, because I'd done business studies, spent quite a bit of time studying marketing, obviously. And so I was like, yeah, no, that sounds interesting as well. And it was just one of those things where timing, the marketing job wasn't ready at the point to make an offer. The automotive one had, and it was like, yeah, you know what, I'll take the automotive one. So that certainly was a moment where could have gone a different path in that sense. And similarly, coming to Switzerland, obviously was a big sliding doors moment for us in that sense. And I would definitely recommend that to people in terms of living outside of your home country, because it just, again, opens you up to living in a different culture, understanding different cultures, and hopefully integrating, obviously, as well. And, I've certainly seen plenty of people in my time in Novartis who had the opportunity to work around, many different countries. Obviously, I did with the US as well. Frankly, I wish I'd done more, actually, but it gets challenging when you got kids and stuff. Our personal view, we didn't want to be moving the kids around all the time. It's disruptive. Not to say that other people should think that, but I've seen plenty of people who move every 2 or 3 years with families. We wouldn't do it, but again, that's their choice. It's up to them. But getting that international experience is fabulous, and we see it with our daughters. So they grew up in going to Swiss schools, speaking Swiss German, and they have a different dynamic when they're with people from other cultures, I think, in that sense. And obviously they partly schooled in the US as well, so they had insight from that too. So definitely gave them something. It was challenging for them, obviously, but it definitely gave them something that they wouldn't have had if we just stayed in the UK and continued to live there.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your advice. I like the fact that you want to open like a door to different perspectives and go outside your home country, have like a varied perspective, especially when you're going into jobs. As you said, you don't want to be a consultant, the same job for 20 years. So that was really interesting. But yeah, we really liked the conversation today. We learned a lot, especially me and Abdul learned a lot, about different nuances in consulting and procurement. So Abdul, do you have any more additional thoughts before? All right. But thank you so much, Chris. We'd love to have you on again for another conversation. But thank you so much for coming on today, and we really appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for the opportunity. It's always good having these kind of discussions, because it gets you thinking about stuff as well. So why did I do that? But yeah, so it's enjoyed it very much. Good questions.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.